5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all our witnesses for joining us today. Dr. Berman, in your testimony, you mentioned that the 23% sales tax rate proposed by the Fair Tax Act is too good to be true. Why is that?
A couple of reasons. One is that it's represented differently from other sales taxes. It would actually add 30% to the price of a good at the register. I talked about how there were just some conceptual errors in the way the math was done that assumes basically you're going to have a big tax on all the state and local governments and the federal government unless they're prepared to reduce their spending by something like 30%, they would need additional revenues or to be exempt from the tax. It assumes that there's no tax evasion. That's not true in any sales tax, and this isn't a particularly well-designed one. And it also assumes an impossibly broad tax base, much broader than in any of the states. Everything, every new purchase would be subject to tax.
So let's work through an example. On an ordinary transaction, say you go to the store, you buy something that's $100, and so how much tax would I owe on that transaction? Wouldn't I just owe $23 since it's a 23% tax on this product following the approach of the states that impose the sales tax?
The 23% rate would imply that there'd be $30 added to the price.
Which is not how most people think of a sales tax today.
Not the way people think of sales taxes.
And so there's this big difference in terms of this tax exclusive rate as opposed to what the tax rate is that most people think about.
Yes.
I also wanted to follow up on an earlier conversation. Mr. Hayes suggested that the fair tax is airtight. You go to Walmart, you buy something, you're subject to the tax and the 30% tax, I guess, versus the 23% tax. But is really that simple? Or are there other compliance issues that we should be concerned about?
Yeah, I mean, every state has issues with compliance with their sales taxes. People go to other places and buy things and then don't report the tax when they come into the state. I remember there's a liquor store in New Hampshire, right? When you cross the border from Massachusetts, liquor's not taxed in New Hampshire, and it is in Massachusetts. You're supposed to pay the tax when you come back into the state, but chances are most people didn't do that. Compliance with use taxes is really, really low. There are lots of ways to avoid a retail sales tax. Unlike a value-added tax, which Alan Viard talked about, this one's tax collected all at the cash register, all at the final retail level. So if the retailer does not remit the tax, the revenue authority loses all of the revenue, and that could be really significant. At a 30% rate, it's 30% of the sale price. If you correct some of the other errors, it could be 60 or 70 or 80%. If you adopted a model that was more like the one that the states have adopted, which is generally that food and medicine are exempt from tax, some other things are exempt from the tax, probably reflecting political reality, then there's an incentive to try to make things that are taxed look like they're not taxed. I don't have an example for Walmart, but I lectured about this when I was teaching at Syracuse University, and I talked about tax evasion, and a student raised her hand and she said, well, at Wegmans, if you eat food there, it's subject to the state sales tax. If you take it home with you, it's not. So I would buy the food, go out the door, and then come back in the other door and sit at one of the counters and eat their food and avoid the tax. And that was to avoid a 7 or 8% tax and not a 30 or 40 or 80% tax.
Thank you. You also talk in your testimony about how investing in children is one of the most productive investments we can make. I could not agree with you more, which is why I've been very much focused on restoring the enhanced child tax credit that we enacted in the American Rescue Plan. We cut child poverty nearly in half and could have done more beyond that. Some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to add work requirements to the child tax credit or want to limit the refundability of the credit so families who need it the most would not be eligible to receive the full credit. I wondered if you could speak to the long-term economic benefits of the enhanced child tax credit, and specifically the importance of ensuring that low-income families have access to the full credit.
Yeah, it's really important that low-income people have access to the credit. There is some evidence that some families took time out of the workforce in response to the child tax credit, but the reason that they do it is probably because they have young children who during the pandemic didn't have child care available to them. They might have other dependent disabled relatives who need their help. They might be investing in skills development, job skills that would help them to earn higher wages when they go back.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And in pursuant to committee practice, we're now going to move to 2-to-1 on questioning. Mr. Estes, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here at today's